Hello and salutations, my fellow philosophers. Welcome back to the Philos-Hippie podcast, where we explore the intersection of philosophy and spirituality and how we can live more holistic and meaningful secular lives. In today's episode of the podcast, I want to elaborate a little more in depth as to what exactly spiritual exercises are, because I've made reference to them many times throughout the podcast so far without fully elaborating on them. This channel is very much inspired by the work of the French philosopher Pierre Hadot and his acclaimed text Philosophy as a Way of Life. This book is just a compilation of lectures Hadot gave during the 80s and 90s, but in it, he highlights how radically different ancient philosophy is from modern philosophy today. The key difference between ancient and modern philosophy was that philosophy was not some abstract discipline that attempted to examine the nature of reality from the comfort of leather backed armchairs and ivory white towers, but rather, philosophy was a lived practice anyone could take a part of. According to Hadot, philosophy was rooted in ascesis and not asceticism, but ascesis was a Greek term meaning training or discipline. It was ultimately a framework for living according to wisdom, and one trained in their wisdom through spiritual exercises. Pierre Hadot defined spiritual exercises as practices that were rooted in ancient philosophy like Stoicism, Platonism, and Epicureanism, which were designed to transform the self, modifying one's inner life, perception, and conduct in order to achieve wisdom, freedom, and a more universal viewpoint. These spiritual exercises were a compilation of meditations, prayers, visualization techniques, repetitions of maxims, and contemplative practices that are aimed at transforming the self through the process of metanoia, which is a Greek word meaning a change of mind and or heart. Some ancient examples of spiritual exercises would include contemplating one's place in the cosmos, mental visualizations like Marcus Aurelius's famous view from above, which would train one to live according to reason, and meditations on death and mortality. Stay tuned next week for a deep dive on spiritual exercises related to how we can actually prepare for death in a more philosophical manner. In Philosophy as a Way of Life, Hadot writes that we actually have, quote, two lists of well-known Stoico-Platonic spiritual exercises from Philo of Alexandria, and they are as follows: research, thorough investigation, reading, listening, attention, mindfulness, labeled as prosochi in the Greek, self-mastery, and indifference to indifferent things. And then the next list is reading, meditations, therapies of the passions, remembrance of good things, self-mastery, and the accomplishment of duties. I'll go more into what all those mean in another episode someday that's more in depth for a longer video. But for now, the purpose of all these exercises was to train oneself in the training regimen of self mastery, which led to the increased or complete knowledge of the self, which, in the eyes of the ancients, was the true source of internal freedom and peace. And when I use the term spiritual and spirituality, I do not mean to imbue any connotations of religion with it, despite the majority of humanity using the term spirituality and religion interchangeably. Now, I won't dive into the nuanced differences between these two terms because I already covered that in the very first episode of the podcast if you're interested in learning more about that. So go click there if you're interested. What you need to know for now is that the term spiritual is a highly charged term in modernity today, but in antiquity, that wasn't the case. Hadot says that the expression spiritual exercises is a bit disconcerting for the contemporary reader. In the first place, it's no longer quite fashionable these days to use the word spiritual. He says that, quote, it's nevertheless necessary to use this term. I believe because none of the other adjectives we could use, psychic, moral, ethical, intellectual, of thought, of the soul, covers all the aspects of reality that we want to describe. These exercises, in fact, correspond to a transformation of our vision of the world into a metamorphosis of our personality, end quote. Spirituality, in this sense, is more of a humanistic term rather than a strictly religious term. Spirituality encompasses the vast spectrum of the human condition and doesn't compartmentalize the totality of life. Of course, many modern philosophers would scorn the idea that philosophy and spirituality are inherently connected, but I have to disagree with them. Although one can engage in philosophy without being spiritual, which is perfectly fine, and in fact needed for some areas of study and analysis, I do not think it is possible to be spiritual without being simultaneously philosophical. Philosophy and spirituality are deeply related to each other, and I feel that the former is crucial for development in the latter. This is why I dislike the label spiritual but not religious, in favor of the label that I came up with, spiritual and philosophical, or SAP, not SBNR for spiritual but not religious. Again, check out the first episode of the podcast to learn more about what that means exactly because I go much more in depth about it there. What I really want to illustrate in this crash course, this primer on spiritual exercises, is that they are not reserved in history for the ancients, but are a living practice that we can all strive towards. We live in an era where people are growing increasingly disillusioned from religion, but are left disoriented, not knowing where to get that spiritual footing in this world without an omniscient, omnipresent sky daddy giving them meaning and purpose in their lives. If we look at the definition of spiritual exercises again, we can see that it is broad enough to encapsulate a number of forms and isn't restricted solely to practices conducted during antiquity. At least I believe so. Spiritual exercises at its core are simply practices that transform the self, modify one's inner life, perception, and conduct to achieve wisdom, freedom, and a more universal viewpoint, like I said earlier. This can manifest in hundreds of ways, like Vipassana meditation, retreating into nature, volunteering, creating art, traveling, philosophizing, and even more mundane topics like reading and writing. Or it can even manifest in sports like skiing. Stay tuned for that episode in the near future. What really matters the most here is that when you engage in these spiritual exercises, you must pick something that compels you to transform your personality and perspectives of the world in a way that deeply resonates with you. Whatever actually gets you to practice these exercises regularly is the key here, and God forbid to enjoy them as well. Too often, when we think of spirituality, we immediately think of ascetic monks living in a cave that deprives themselves of all the world has to offer. But that doesn't have to be the case. Being spiritual and philosophical doesn't mean a life of seriousness and negation, but rather, it is about fully embracing and affirming all of life in its myriad forms. So, if there's one thing I hope you take away from this episode, it's this: spiritual exercises are not relics in a museum of ancient thought, nor are they prescriptions handed down by prophets or priests. They are timeless invitations, invitations to train our attention, to reshape our habits of perception, and to live with a little more intention in a world that constantly pulls us in towards distraction and fragmentation. So maybe take this as a gentle challenge, especially since we're at the new year. Pick one exercise, one practice, one discipline that speaks to you, and treat it not as self improvement, but as self formation. Let philosophy leave the armchair. Let spirituality lose its mystical fog, and see what happens when thinking becomes a way of living. Thanks for watching this episode of the Philos-Hippie podcast. I hope you found it enlightening. I hope I will see you next time as we'll do a deep dive on ancient spiritual exercises centered around preparing us for our deaths and training us in the lost Socratic art of dying and learning that to philosophize is to learn to die. In the meantime, I'll see you next time. I wish you well and I wish you wisdom. Peace.